Hut, fan pizza to go. Pizza Hut, pizza to go. Our fan pizza's as close as your phone, so bring it on home. Pizza Hut, pizza to go.
What's the perfect gift for a house full of teenagers? Why give them anything? They'll only eat it.
How about a Sunbeam hot air corn popper? Just $29.95 this week at Canadian Tire. And this Sunbeam Mixmaster hand mixer is just $17.95. It makes all sorts of things your kids will love.
And with the money you save, buy a padlock for your refrigerator.
Canadian Tire lets you give like Santa
And save like Scrooge.
BCTV, we're giving it all we got.
Good morning. A bit of a riot at Oakalla Prison in Burnaby last night. Some trouble about long-time prisoners or sentenced prisoners mixing it with people on remand. And here's what it sounded like when it started last night at 7:30.
The rampage began at the dinner hour. More than 100 inmates in the West Wing of Oakalla smashed windows, furniture, and screamed obscenities at guards and police. The violence erupted when inmates refused to be locked up for the evening and instead ran for doors at each side of the 5-tier block. The Burnaby Fire Department surrounded the building in an effort to douse several fires burning inside. The West Wing is used primarily for inmates on remand, people awaiting trial. There were 165 prisoners in the wing when the riot broke out, 14 below capacity. Stan Hofseth is the director of the wing.
There's approximately 112 still barricaded in there. We've removed 53, into another wing that we're willing to move. The others are barricaded and will not come out.
What touched it off, Stan?
I can't really say. I got a phone call at home at 7:30 and said there was a riot underway, you'd better get in.
Anybody hurt?
No one is hurt yet. As far as we know, no staff and no inmates. They are using fire hoses and to douse the fires, but no one has been hurt as far as I know.
Fires?
There were minor fires to start with. This is what started it. Burnaby Fire Department's here, the RCMP, and we have the place surrounded.
Just after dinner?
No hostage, no negotiations. I've asked for a spokesman, and no one's willing to talk. All those that have asked to come out, though, have been removed.
Can you describe the scene in there for us?
Well, it's just water pouring off all the tiers from five landings. They go into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories high, and the water is just pouring out at the present time.
All the prisoners out of their cells?
All the prisoners that remain in the wing are barricaded out of their cells on a tier.
How many?
112. 53 have been removed.
Later, 32 members of the RCMP tactical squad moved in. They are prepared to storm the building using tear gas. As the riot intensified, another 27 of the inmates surrendered. Six hours later, at 1:45 a.m., it was over. Firemen persisted in watering down the prisoners, which finally cooled tempers.
They were holed up in 2 or 3 tiers and caused considerable damage to the interior of the west wing of the prison. The cause of the disturbance is not known at this time, and any response to that would have to come from the prison officials. The inmates have all been removed from the area of the disturbance, and there are no injuries, and it's all quiet now.
How did it come to an end?
Well, there was considerable water in the area by the prison staff, and eventually the inmates were convinced that they should break off their disturbance.
There were some minor injuries, mostly from flying glass. There is no estimate of the cost, but prison officials say most of the West Wing is demolished.
And you'll recall, too, that many of the prisoners in Oakalla were last year moved, those awaiting trial, into a fancy new remand centre down beside the police station in the city of Vancouver. That doesn't seem to have helped much. Undoubtedly, the provincial government will order a full-scale inquiry into the causes of the riot at Oakalla Prison Farm, formerly called the Lower Mainland Regional Correctional Centre. Later in the program, I have a fascinating story about a Canadian spy for the KGB, a fellow called Hugh Hambleton. The story is told, as Hambleton is still in jail in Britain, put there by the Brits, by author Leo Heaps.
Well, Hugh Hambleton's major spying activities really took place in the Caribbean area. It took place in Israel, where he set up a network, and for 6 years he was a trusted NATO official that gave thousands of documents over to NATO. He was an international spy.
Thousands of documents
thousands of documents over from NATO to the communists, to his contact in the Soviet espionage service.
Fascinating thing about Hambleton, who was a professor at a university in Eastern Canada, he was investigated but never charged in this country, but when he unwisely went to Britain, the Brits nailed him, nabbed him, and gave him 10 years for spying. Now, I've got to go back to the Solidarity Caper. After Premier Bennett's broadcast last week and the apparent understandings on all sides, it seems to me to be quite editorial that the provincial government, perhaps flushed with victory, is by a kind of chintzy attitude, complicated, stubborn, foul-up, going to create more difficulties which could easily have been avoided. I'm talking about what seems to be the firm dicta of the provincial government, that the full 188 days of instruction must be made up by teachers in this year's budget. One would have thought that the teaching strikers' loss of pay might have been sufficient punishment, and that the school boards could have handled the money as legally required. In an attempt to give you the latest before the Cabinet comes to a decision today, if it comes to one, I have asked Joy Leach, the president of the BC School Trustees Association, to try and help us understand this final foul-up. Also in the studio today will be Pat Clarke, vice president of the BC Teachers Federation, and we'll tackle this chintzy business of the teachers' 3 days pay and what's to be done with the money after the break.
My understanding of the agreement is this, that the 3 days in which children lost instruction is to be made up in the sometime during the school year 1983-1984.
It all seems so unnecessary. I thought that all the inquests had been held and that common sense would apply. Everything else is fairly settled with Solidarity. There seems to be some irritation between Monroe and Kirby, but that's their problem for the moment. It certainly ain't mine. The teachers. Some teachers were out for 3 days. Legally or illegally, they were out for 3 days. Not all the teachers in the province. And as I understood the final position clearly from Premier Bennett and everybody else, the government had agreed to use moral suasion to force unwilling school boards to negotiate, or at least to prepare letters of intent to negotiate on exemption from Bill 3 for seniority and severance pay for teachers who probably will be laid off down the line a little bit. The government had also agreed to use moral suasion that there shouldn't be any reprisals anywhere. It's admitted by the government that it's the school boards who have control of the expenditure of the money, but the position taken by the government is yes, 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 do what you like, but there must be 188 days of instruction in the school year, so ipso facto, those teachers who struck, or maybe all teachers, including those who struck, must put in an extra 3 days this year, and the money saved between $12 and $18 million must not be used to lighten any possible layoff load next year. Is that the public position as was understood up to now, Joy Leach?
I think it is as clear as you can get it.
Clear as you can get it. Now, what is the situation after your meeting with Heinrich, the Minister of Education, yesterday?
Well, we had the meeting yesterday. It was the first meeting that we've been included in, and which is somewhat irritating to us, since we are, in fact, the employer of teachers. And the government is not, through the minister, is not the employer of teachers. Consequently, it seems somewhat late to be discussing these matters with us. We obviously, if there are solutions to problems that are still present today, those solutions are held at the local level.
Are you prevented by any dicta of the provincial government from doing what you wish with the unspent teachers' salaries, which doesn't go to those on strike, between $12 and $18 million? Are you prevented from using your common sense and spending it as you wish?
Well, it depends on the view of government. The government pays school districts through grants. If government sets conditions or says, for example, in terms of the money that was saved during the work stoppage, that they will take the money back unless we do certain things, then obviously they have their hands on the purse string.
Have they said that to you?
They have said to us that we may keep the money if the money is used to pay teachers for making up the 3 lost days.
In this school year?
Yes.
But
now, our position is that we ought not to be directed in terms of how we ought to spend monies which were saved in a work stoppage which affected our children in our school districts. What we are corporate entities. We are elected to manage those dollars. We had an agreement, and it's in legislation now. The government indeed sets a level of funding for the year in education, and it is then the school districts and the school board's responsibility to manage those funds. We say those funds are part of the monies that we have to manage.
Therefore, are you not bound by the School Act and the obvious line of the government to open the schools an additional 3 days for those teachers who struck to spend that money?
No, that really isn't the case.
But is that not what they want?
That appears to be what they want at this time.
Is that common sensible?
No, not in our opinion. What we think is that it's absolutely essential for us to be able to ensure to government, to the students and to the taxpayers, that they will get value for their money, that all of the curriculum will be covered, and that the children will suffer no educational loss as a result of this disruption. We can do that. We can ensure, we can make an absolute commitment that that will happen.
Are you telling Premier Bennett or his merry men this morning that given the authority, which you have, the corporate status, you will spend unexpended teachers' salaries accrued as a result of a strike in the current school year to make up any lost education?
In the current school year is the most important term. It isn't, the fiscal year and the school year are not concurrent, and that causes us a problem. But in the current school year, yes, indeed, we are quite prepared to make that commitment and say that it will be made up, it will be used to compensate for the loss of education that the students suffered during the 3 days.
By what time next year? By what time? What time's the end of your school year?
June, end of June.
In other words, you would spend that by June next year.
Most probably. And I don't want to suggest that every single school board is going to do that, because every single school board is a corporate entity which stands alone and makes its own corporate decisions.
But isn't Bennett's stubborn point, the fact is that he will not let you use that in the next budgetary year?
I don't think it's out of stubbornness. I think that, as you know, there was a Kelowna Accord. And although it's not in writing and we were not partners to it, it does seem to suggest that there would be a requirement for teachers to teach the time that they gave up and get compensated for it. Now, and there is some suggestion that there would be negotiations between local boards and their teachers over those dollars. And really, as school boards, we're quite simply saying we are not prepared to negotiate with people who withdrew their service for money for our children. That already is money that is in our budgets, and we ought to, in our wisdom, direct those dollars in the best interest of those students.
In other words,
we don't want to negotiate with the
you're
teachers over
telling me
this money.
there's an understanding somewhere that you can use the money to pay teachers who are on strike, which would reward them for being on strike.
That's right, and we disagree adamantly with that. What we're saying is we are the employers of teachers in this province. We ought to get back to that fact because it has been very clouded in the past months. Let us do our job. We will establish, as we have in the past, a relationship with teachers that is based on the ethic and morality of the community.
Are you prepared, and you can speak for the BCSTA, to guarantee that none of these unexpended strikers' salaries would be used to lessen the impact of predicted layoffs?
No.
Isn't that what Bennett wants?
No. Mr. Bennett wants to, Mr. Bennett, the government, wants to be sure that the monies are not used to prevent job loss. And that's because government's goal, and it's a well-stated goal, is to downsize education.
Are you prepared to give the government that guarantee that these monies will not be used to prevent job loss?
I can't give that guarantee on behalf of all boards. What I can tell you is that there's insufficient funds to prevent layoff. What I would point out, however, is that in a number of school districts, January is going to be a very disruptive period, much more than the 3-day work stoppage. And that is because school boards are going to be required to lay off a significant number of teachers in January. If they don't take that action, they will have to, there's a multiplying effect, and they would have to lay off up to 3 times as many in June. So consequently, you're going to see a mid-year disruption of, in the way that children will have new teachers, children will be placed in new classes. I think that many boards may wish to direct and feel that they would be doing something more educationally sound if they used the money that was saved during the strike to alleviate that disruption and perhaps extend the employment until June.
In other words, let you use the money until June as you see fit, because it wouldn't make any major difference to layoffs throughout the province.
That's right. However, it will make a difference in terms of the kind of education delivered to our students in our different school districts.
In other words, I'm going long here, but if Bennett had said, okay, they struck for 3 days, they lose 3 days' pay. We give people days off for the Queen. We give people days off for this and that. The last 3 days, make sure you spend that money by the end of June, you'd have been happy. And the teachers would have lost 3 days' pay.
Absolutely. The teachers who did not work,
Was that the common sense solution?
Yes, that's the common sense solution. And it's the solution, only solution that will work, quite frankly, because a centrally directed solution is not going to work because 75 school districts have 75 different needs.
Joy Leach. Next we'll talk to Pat Clarke as well of the BCTF. I hope you can understand that. I'm doing my damnedest. After the war, after the break.
What Jack Monroe has said, and I agree, is that no agreement was made to maintain funding at 1983 levels.
Let me get that. In other words, you gave no concession of increases in school board budgets at any time in your agreed discussions with Monroe.
No, but we did have good discussions, and we did discuss, and Jack Monroe did bring up strike savings, strike savings that he said were to be kept in the education system. That is, from the teachers going on strike. And this is where I agreed. I want to make it very clear. I agreed that, yes, strike savings should be maintained in the system this year to provide the education to our children that was intended when we developed the budget. And the strike savings that were made with when teachers withdrew education and their services from our children, that money would be there so those teachers could restore those days of education and that education that our children have lost, and that would keep the money in the system. Now that will have to be worked out between the teachers and their local school board.
But your guidance is paramount in this. You're saying teachers must work. I wanted to, first of all, before I call for a certain piece of film, with Pat Clarke, Vice President of the BC Teachers Federation. Do you see any clear, simple solution, presuming you have the goodwill, to this particular problem?
Yes, the solution that the trustees are suggesting is very similar to the solution we've suggested. And as far as we're concerned, that's a viable solution.
In other words, you lose 3 days' pay for 3 days' strike.
That's right.
But that the money be used without extending the school year to supply any deficiencies to any particular schools, classes, or students.
Yes, we basically have the same position. We have some differences with the trustees in that there are surpluses we'd like them retained and used in 1984.
Well, that's somewhat different.
Yes.
As far as you're prepared to lose your strike pay, lose your income for the days that a number of you were on strike.
We expected that. You go on a strike, you don't get paid for it. We want that money to be used to employ people and to provide a service to children over the next school year.
And there's the difference. We're saying no strings attached. The wisdom of the board will prevail. The board will use those dollars as it sees fit to make up losses for students in this past month.
But no use to prevent layoffs in the year ahead.
The use of those dollars will be at the discretion of the boards.
All right, let's see what Premier Bennett said to Webster on that Friday broadcast of last week. And we have hurriedly taken out what I trust and I'm sure is the appropriate clip on the Kelowna meeting.
What Jack Monroe has said, and I agree, is that no agreement was made to maintain funding at 1983 levels.
Let me get that. In other words, you gave no concession of increases in school board budgets at any time in your agreed discussions with Monroe.
No, but we did have good discussions, and we did discuss, and Jack Monroe did bring up strike savings, strike savings that he said were to be kept in the education system. That is, from the teachers going on strike. And this is where I agreed. I want to make it very clear. I agreed that, yes, strike savings should be maintained in the system this year to provide the education to our children that was intended when we developed the budget. And the strike savings that were made when teachers withdrew education and their services from our children, that money would be there so those teachers could restore those days of education and that education that our children have lost, and that would keep the money in the system. Now that will have to be worked out between the teachers and their local school board.
But your guidance is paramount in this. You're saying teachers must work additional days to make up the pupil teaching lost in the strike.
I would expect them.
Is that right, sir?
Yes.
Well, that was fairly clear.
Yes, and there's very little disagreement. The school trustees agree with the Premier when he says that the dollars should be left in the system. They should be used to make up losses that the children might have experienced. They should be used to provide education as intended by the government when they set the budget. However, the method of providing that service to children ought to be left to the local board. Now, it may be the case that there will be some districts in British Columbia who say, we think the days need to be made up. But the situation in districts across this province vary dramatically, just as the way the action took place varies dramatically. There are some boards that did not suffer work stoppage as a result of withdrawal of service.
One question to you right now. So therefore, you do not believe the Premier meant that the schools had to open 3 extra days throughout the province where there were closures at all?
I think he said that he meant that, but I think that perhaps he misunderstood that there were a wide range of options in terms of how we would provide the additional service.
I wouldn't be that gracious.
What would you be?
You know, it seems to me that the 3-day thing came out of that caucus meeting towards the end of the week last week, or I guess it was the beginning of the week. And what came out of it was that the teachers were bad. We're going to punish them, and we're going to punish them by dissipating the effect of their strike.
In other words, you would say that any arbitrary act directed by the government to force the schools to open 3 extra days would be reprisals?
Yes.
Well, that doesn't really make sense, because the Minister of Education in his meeting with us yesterday said that he was going to encourage boards not to exercise reprisal, so that if this is a reprisal, then it's contradictory to what the Minister is encouraging from his office. It does smack of punishment, and I think that's one reason why we ought not to be bound by that kind of a direction.
Well, do you have autonomy or do you not have autonomy?
Well,
you have autonomy in your school board,
that's what we asked the government yesterday.
but you don't have autonomy under the School Act.
Oh, no, we do have autonomy under the School Act. We don't have autonomy under the confusion that has prevailed in the past 6 months in this province, because we have had a super employer act on behalf of school boards. And that, we spoke with the minister very clearly about that yesterday. Let's have a little role clarification here. The Minister of Education is the person who is heading up government's ministry, which is to encourage and to provide certain resources for quality education. Local school boards are they're legally constituted corporate bodies with the responsibility of managing education at the local level. If those lines cross, then we have absolute confusion. The Minister of Education does not have the same role as Mr. Chabot. Mr. Chabot is the employer, or acts for the employer.
It's the 188-day thing which sticks in everybody's craw.
But the days don't mean that much. It's whether the curriculum is covered and the student has managed to achieve all of the goals that have been set for a year in education.
It's not a viable solution, and there's no need for it, as Joyce said. That, you know, the fact of the matter is that last year schools were closed for considerably longer than 3 days by an edict of the government, and there were boards all over the province. And when Bennett mentioned, when you asked him last week, and he answered the question by saying, well, we added time onto each day.
Right, 5 minutes a day or something.
A lot of boards didn't do it.
Just ignored it.
They ignored it.
Completely.
Because it wasn't workable.
Wasn't practical.
That's right.
But if you're ordered to go back for 3 days, would those teachers who crossed the picket lines have to go back for 3 days too?
I assume so. No, and the other problem is, and we told the minister this when we met with him on Monday, that the attitude of teachers right now is that if they issued an order for teachers to work 3 more days, they simply, you know, we'd have another problem.
However, Jack, it's very important to say that as a result of our meeting yesterday, the minister gave his word that, and he gave us plenty of time to make clear our position, and we appreciated that time. He is taking our position to his colleagues and has assured us that he will get back to us by the end of the week.
So therefore, the minister hopefully has gone to the cabinet this morning and said to the cabinet, I recommend, with surmising, I recommend that we give the Autonomous School Board full authority to spend the strike savings on teachers' services to make up any missed curriculum without necessarily having to order all the schools open for 3 days.
Not teacher services, services to students. Services to students.
Well, isn't that teacher services?
Not necessarily.
Primarily, but not necessarily.
And we're saying services to students.
Okay. If Victoria comes out with an arbitrary reopen the school for 3 days, there's going to be unnecessary trouble. If they trust the autonomous school boards and hopefully the common sense of the Teachers Federation leadership, the problem is over.
The problem is over once they give the problem to the local level, and the local level, I assure you, will solve it.
And you're happy with that?
Yes, we'd be quite satisfied with that.
And you wouldn't be threatening to go out on a rampage again?
Well, no, there would be no need for it.
But
we're not threatening a rampage now. We're saying that if they go with that 3-day scam, there will be problems because of it, not necessarily a rampage.
That's our contribution towards understanding this highly complex but really quite simple issue, is it not?
Yes, and I think we're near peace in the schools. I hope that. I think everybody wants it, and I think it can be reached by this weekend.
Can anybody stand phone calls on this morning? Oh, we got it. Now. Joy Leach, BC School Trustees. Pat Clarke, BC Teachers Federation. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Joy Leach.
Yes.
It seems to me that that a contract is a contract is a contract is a contract. And defeated and embittered NDP candidates, Joy Leach and Art Cuby, should lay their NDP politics aside long enough to admit to the existence of that contract and not say now that, oh, but that contract isn't really that important vis-a-vis 188 teaching days. And I don't think you should assume the position as employers of the teachers and the government as well, dictating to the government and to...
Okay, hold on a second. I want to get this embittered NDP candidate back.
I'm not an embittered NDP candidate.
Were you ever one, just a matter of...
Was I ever... I was a candidate, years ago, for a nomination which I didn't get happily.
Yeah, I always thought you were on the other side of the spectrum, to be quite honest.
I think I'm right smack in the middle.
Good. Okay, he was nasty to you. You've got to take a couple of nasty calls on Webster.
What can you do?
From Vernon, go ahead, please.
Yes, regarding Joy Leach, I would like to compliment her on her explanation of what was actually taking place during the past week with the discussions. So many of us have been very, very confused, and I think she's been an excellent guest this morning.
Yeah, I now think I understand it quite clearly, and I think all of us are agreed on the basic facts involved at the moment in this.
Yes, yes. And thank you very much. It's nice to have her on the show.
Thank you.
Simon Arm, go ahead, please.
I also appreciate Joy Leach's explanation. However, I'm wondering about the school boards that wisely prevented disruption by keeping their teachers on until June and hoping that they could then make the big cut in September. What are they supposed to do with the extra money now that they have on their hands?
Well, it's quite clear that school boards ought not to use the money to continue employment, which would have to end as soon as those dollars ran out. I mean, clearly there's insufficient money to continue employment. We might ease transition. However, the school boards, for example, experienced rather high, significantly high legal costs as a result of this disruption. There are no monies in the budget to cover that, so it would seem that this would be an appropriate use of that money. Also, under Bill 3, it was necessary for us to negotiate severance conditions. We don't have any funding in our budgets for those kinds of extraordinary expenses. So the wise board will allocate those dollars in the very best interests of running their educational system.
How many boards have negotiated under Bill 3 successfully or have letters of intent?
We have about 30 now.
About 30 out of 75?
Yes.
Any of them dragging their feet?
A few.
A few?
Yes, we're getting, mediators are being appointed in those.
Mediators for the Bill 3 negotiations?
Yes, specifically Bill 3.
And then, of course, you've got Heinrich's moral suasion standing there in the background.
Well, usually that's somewhat unusual. To suggest that Bill 3, which was put in place by the government, requires now moral suasion to employers to negotiate out of Bill 3, then one wonders why the same government that put Bill 3 in as a club needs to give us moral suasion to avoid the legislation they put in place. Now, I think that school boards are reasonable and responsible employers, and I expect to see those exclusions negotiated, but I am very annoyed with the suggestion that the government that put Bill 3 in now feels that it needs to provide moral suasion to the employer to avoid
there's a hole in the
effect
act
of that.
there because both parties must go to PEC together.
Indeed, they must.
And if one doesn't want to go, they can't go to PEC.
And Bill 3 prevails. If Bill 3 is unfair, do something about Bill 3.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, when you played the clip, you stated that it was very clear and precise. I also agree that the clip was very clear and precise. So I can't see how Joy Leach would say that the Premier didn't understand what he was saying.
No, please, I didn't mean that in any kind of a derogatory way. I think that the Premier was absolutely committed to retaining, and he made it very clear in his tape, that he's committed to retaining that money in the school system for educational purposes. All we're saying is that there is a wisdom that needs to be applied from the local level in terms of how to best benefit students, not teachers, students. Now, if we were to interpret the minister's position that simply suggested that those teachers, if they return the 3 days of lost work, they would then get 3 additional days of pay, there would be no economic disadvantage to the teacher for having exercised what we think was illegal action against school boards.
And you're prepared to accept that, to lose the pay?
We're prepared to accept the pay. We'd have a quibble about the illegality of the whole thing. That's not established.
Well, we're not prepared to give you the pay.
Not established. You should appeal the case and make it an established fact. And then, when Mr. Hendricks, the minister, says it was illegal, you can then challenge him on it.
We can go on forever on that. There's the Ontario decision that all restraint was illegal, name of goodness, and I think the Solidarity or the BC Fed or somebody has taken that to court too. This could go on for 1,000 years, but what happens in the meantime? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, my feelings on this are that the teachers were not paid for the 3 days off, and now the government is asking that to keep what they have, they should have to provide 3 days for free. Well, I'm sure that the IWA or any other large union like that would be most upset at having to.
I'm sorry, that's not the understanding that we have. And the understanding is that the monies can be kept in the school districts only if those monies are used to pay teachers for 3 days.
Yeah, but shouldn't that be on next year's?
Not at all. There's no expectation that it would go on next year's, because the money is not to be used to extend positions that government hopes to eliminate from the education system.
And with that, you accept that particular dicta?
The government has the right to do that.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Jack and Gats. First of all, this province is operating in a deficit. Now, to my way of thinking, so much money would be borrowed to pay for 188 school days of education. If there's only 185, we wouldn't have to borrow as much. Now, Premier Bennett came out and said he would take the money back that was saved during the strike at the beginning of the strike. Then later on, to appease people, he said, if you want to make up the 3 days, we'll go out and borrow the money to pay for the 188 days. And it seems to me that your guests are losing track of all that. That's all he's saying. He's just saying that the money would be borrowed in the first place if it was for to pay teacher salaries, not to pay janitors or anything else. And I just can't see why you can't get back to that argument.
Now, that is an interesting point. That's the first time that anybody has mentioned the fact that there was another employee group out. And what on earth does the government think that we ought to do about the non-teaching people who were out? They're not being mentioned at all. But I will point out that we think that those dollars, and know that those dollars were originally put into our budgets to provide service to children. And I think that those dollars ought to be directed to that purpose.
You mean to say, like, we'll say CUPE, janitors, maintenance men, heating engineers.
Mm-hmm.
If you open the schools 3 days, they'd have to be brought back and paid.
Well, it certainly would seem so.
And you'd say that money, if it was saved, could be put into the teaching instruction to students out of the total savings.
Not necessarily teaching instruction, but in the benefit of students. I'm not going to walk into a situation where I'm going to say that school boards in this province are going to use those dollars directly to put it into the pockets of teachers.
You know, sorry, ask your question.
No, you go.
You know, our point about the funds that are there, in effect we'll call them a surplus if you like, because it's money that was not spent.
Unspent monies.
You know, we think the most important thing that can be done with that money is to provide a service to children, and we agree with the trustees to that extent. You made the remark earlier about that's primarily teachers, and I agree with you, that's teachers. What we're worried about are the effect that it's going to have on class size, the effect that it's going to have in disruptions, possibly in January, certainly in September, and overall what it's doing to public education in the province. And what teachers are saying is use the money productively. That's a big word right now. Use the money productively in providing service to children, which means mainly keeping staff in the system, teachers and support staff.
But not for the 84 budget.
Until September, until June.
Until June.
If there's a surplus that can be carried over to the following year.
They won't let you carry over a surplus, isn't that correct? No carry over a surplus.
Well, we are in fact talking about rolling over a surplus because the fiscal year and the school year don't balance.
But using common sense, saying that...
Let us get through this school year. That's what we're saying.
So that's a modification you need from Mr. Bennett.
Yeah.
After the break. Well, maybe they're discussing this at Cabinet right now. They should be this morning, shouldn't they? Did Heinrich say they were going to talk about it today?
He said he would take our position to his colleagues, and that we're certainly hoping that he will be able to get back to us by the end of the week. I think he did understand some of the very serious problems, and the hearing that we had was a sympathetic hearing.
Yeah, I don't think we can say the same thing, frankly, Jack. Our hearing was somewhat different. We didn't get any assurances that any of our positions would be taken to Cabinet, even though we substantially agreed with the trustees in some significant areas. And I think it's an indication of what's happening, an indication of why this 3-day thing started in the first place. There's a determination there to hammer us.
Yeah, but I must say
it seems to be petty.
Well, but I still have to say that school trustees wonder why it is that the minister would be negotiating with the BCTF anyway, because that's called provincial bargaining, and we do not agree with that.
He shouldn't even be talking to the BCTF, should he?
That's our opinion.
Because you're the employers.
We're the employer, and that's where the confusion lies. And if we want provincial bargaining, wipe out school boards. Eliminate. Don't use us as puppets. Don't say to us last week that we can solve the problems locally, and then next week say provincially we're going to solve the problem and lay it on you locally. Let's get consistent here. That's all we're saying. And I think that Mr. Heinrich understands that that's necessary to rationalize the system.
Can I just make one, just to refresh my own memory? Your budget of the year ends on December 31st.
Yes.
Your school year ends in June.
Yes.
The monies saved are in the budget that ends on December 31st.
Yes.
Right? And you say, let's use that, even though it goes against the dicta of 84, use that common sensibly through till the end of the school year in 84.
Yes. Do you understand why? You see, because we will have to exercise layoffs in January. If we don't, we have to keep spending money, which makes our next year's budget short. So we will have to lay off, for example, if you lay off 20 teachers now, you'll lay off 50 teachers in June. If you don't take that, if you don't lay off the teachers in January, then you will have to lay off 50 in June. Now, if you take but laying them off in January is very disruptive. It means that...
Middle of the school year.
Middle of the school year. Now, some school boards might not have that problem. Maybe their problem comes next year. They might want to use that money. It might be the best educational decision to use that money for early retirement programs, to get senior teachers out of the system, high-priced teachers that are tired of teaching out of the system with an incentive, which was encouraged by government last year. If they could do that, that means that they can keep the young blood in the system in the following years. Now that is a brilliant move.
Quizzical look at Pat Clarke.
I'm not suggesting that those teachers at the top end that have maybe a couple of years more to go aren't valuable. I'm not suggesting that at all. But it might be the case that they would opt for early leaving from the system if there were an advantage. And it was an early retirement program encouraged by government last year, but we can't afford it in many districts this year.
Chilliwack.
Yes, sir. I've been watching your program and thinking that both these sides of this dispute have a moral position, and they're having so much difficulty with our own governments. What chance do those kids from yesterday's program in the high school have of finding some solution to world situation?
Oh, please don't mix apples and oranges. Please don't, but it's a very thoughtful call.
I think that she's right to call on all of us to be responsible and to solve this problem. I think that woman is right.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to point out that these people have a contract with the taxpayers of British Columbia to produce 188 days of school instruction. If they can do the job just as well in 185, they've already been getting too much money. They're obviously not efficient enough. And I would like to say that the people who should be let out, and quickly, are the delegates to the Teachers Federation who elect these leaders. And I would also like to say that I think that this president of the Trustees Association could look into a conflict of interest. I don't know whether she's a former teacher. And I would like to say about Mr. Webster that you certainly have egg on your face for that silly introduction, which was completely wrong. I'd like to see you sentenced to 3 days of facing your mirror in the morning and saying, I'm usually wrong.
I'm sentenced to 90 minutes a day of seeing my face on the screen, and if you think that makes me feel good, ma'am, you're misguided.
I think what she's saying, of course, is a plague on all our houses, and I'm sure that almost everybody feels the same
It's
way.
the one last tiddly little thing left over from this incredible
That's right.
dispute.
Yes. Our contract...
Which, praise be the Lord, is in the main solved.
That's right, and our contract is to provide education service to
There's nothing in it about
students.
days.
And it's not, the days are even government last year said the days don't matter, but the content matters a lot.
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd just like to say, all these people that are belly aching and everything over this Restraint Act, I don't see what reason they have to bellyache. They weren't forced to be a teacher. They weren't forced to be a government worker. Why can't they just go to work and keep their mouth shut and get their job done instead of bellyaching all the time?
Yeah. And tip their forelocks to the boss every day.
I'd like to point out, if I may, speaking to the woman's comment, I am not a teacher. I have never been a teacher. I wouldn't want the job. I think it's a very difficult and challenging job. I'm a lay person in the education system.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
I agree with the woman's statement, although not quite so strongly. I think that the priorities have to be kept straight here. Where does that 188 days come from?
School Act.
Well,
doesn't it?
It's set by the minister. The Minister of Education determines the number of days in any particular school year. There's not a prescribed number in the Act. As a matter of fact, in a lot of school years, there's 196 days. There could be 193. It varies from year to year.
Well, then why can't you stay? I mean, it's obviously there for a reason. Education is important to the kids. Rather than playing political and economic games with salaries, I think we're losing sight of our priorities here.
Well, I think so too.
Yeah, well, that's
I think we all agree with you that we have to get back to the main purpose of all of this enterprise, and that is to provide education for children. And I think there is a desire on the part of the minister and government, local level government through school boards and teachers to do that. We simply have to get over this last hurdle, and we will have peace in the schools, and that's what we all want.
Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems is we don't know who a teacher is anymore. Your union man keeps talking about teachers, which is just masquerading the fact that there are many people that don't teach, principals, administrators, and they're all in the union. And our sleepy school boards, I think we need Levesque here to get rid of these local boards.
Well, Bill 3 does a couple of things.
Yeah, well, both of you people don't sound too bright.
Let's talk about what Levesque did in the province of Quebec. He managed to inspire massive teacher strikes and massive closures of schools, and a massive loss of public education.
He took away the local boards.
He did that. He did, and he said we will control education
Yourself
centrally.
said you don't like a teacher's job. Well, then what are you doing in education?
That's a pointless call. It really is. I get a little short-tempered at times. My effort this morning was to express my own opinion that it seems kind of ludicrous that obviously is a common-sense way to avoid further roiling, broiling, and trouble after a very tense month in which we came very close to a general strike. That strike has been avoided. Calm and reason has finally prevailed, and this is one little niggly thing that could be settled in 5 minutes if the school boards are given the authorities under the restrictions of Premier Bennett. It mustn't be used to lessen layoff, to spend that money saved by the teacher strike, not merely by the budgetary year end of December, but by the school year end of June. Is that a good summary?
I think so.
Thank you very much, Pat Clarke. Thank you very much, Joy Leach. The back of my hand to those people that don't like me. I couldn't care less this morning, and I'll be back after the break. Before I introduce my guest to show you the book, see if your memory is as good as mine, and mine's a bit faulty. Remember there was a big shot Canadian who was threatened with charges of spying under the Official Secrets Act in Canada, and the Mounties warned him not to go to Britain. So he went to Britain. The British nabbed him, And in Old Bailey in London, the British Attorney General told the jury that this particular guy, this Canadian, Hugh Hambleton, was a spy, a highly valued agent of the KGB who had compromised every member of the NATO alliance. Now, I don't know where Hambleton is now or what Hambleton's doing, but I have in my studio a Canadian historian of some considerable background. Soldier, novelist, playwright, and involved in making peace between the Haganah and the Ergun Tzvai Leumi in Eretz Israel. And his name is Leo Heaps. Now, what are you actually doing now for a living, Leo?
Writing books, plays, motion picture scripts, but mainly writing books.
Are you an ex-spy yourself in any way, shape, or form?
No, but I have worked for MI6 quite a while ago, but have never been a spy, and nor do I aspire particularly.
How dare you write a book about a Canadian with a distinguished record in this country, Hugh Hambleton, spy, 30 years with the KGB? Have you been sued on the book yet?
No, but I might be at any moment. This is possible. I've been sued before for libel. Wouldn't be the first time.
Did you lose?
No, we settled, which is another form of loss.
You lost?
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about this incredible... is my memory vaguely correct that he was warned not to go to Britain because he might be picked up by the British and charged as an agent of the KGB?
That's right. He was warned by the Canadians, mainly because the Canadians weren't through interrogating him and because it was a great embarrassment to the Canadians, who had not really pursued this man and had let him off extremely lightly.
Start at the beginning. Tell me about Hugh Hambleton.
Well, Hugh Hambleton, major spying activities really took place in the Caribbean area. It took place in Israel, where he set up a network. And for 6 years, he was a trusted NATO official that gave thousands of documents over to NATO. He was an international spy.
Thousands of documents
thousands of documents over from NATO to the communists, to his contact in the Soviet espionage service. And Hambleton, of course, was just discovered by accident. He was discovered because a major Soviet spy in New York was caught at a traffic infringement, and he happened to have some compromising documents on him. And thus Hambleton's name was given eventually to the RCMP. And the Canadians, you know, you can't make it in Canada, so you go abroad. And it was the British who really brought the attention of Hambleton to the Canadians, the magnitude of his spying activity.
Now, Hambleton is a Canadian?
He's a Canadian, a professor, born and bred in Ottawa. He's a professor at Laval University, a non-French Canadian at the university. He has also had a very distinguished career as a member of CETA, the Canadian Industrial Development Agency, where he used as a front for his spying in South America and the Caribbean area. Grenada was a place he visited to set up the network. He's a man who has been amazingly and terribly underestimated. Sir Michael Havers in the Old Bailey, having the complete record, thought that he was one of the major spies of this generation.
Now, when did he begin his operations?
Began his operations when he was recruited in Ottawa in 1950 by a Soviet agent called Borodin, who worked for the Soviet embassy. He then went to France. He completed his work at the Sorbonne, where he got a PhD, and the Soviets directed him towards NATO, where he worked for 5 years. His work in NATO was so thorough and painstaking that within 48 hours, every major decision of NATO and every important document was in a copy of every document was in Soviet hands within 48 hours. So the Kremlin knew right from the beginning every single move that NATO made for 5 years that he worked with them. It was irreparable damage, and he left only when he decided he had enough. He wasn't caught. And then he went to London, where he got another PhD in economics. Came back to Canada, and Laval University, he became a professor of economics, and he worked as an espionage agent, a major one again in the Americas. And of course, he was bankrolled by the Canadians through CETA, unknowingly, and I don't think anyone has really been aware of that until this book came out.
The Canadian International Development Association.
That's right, they were very helpful.
It's quite unbelievable, isn't it?
I think it's not only unbelievable, but it shows that everybody knew about this man before the Canadians did. The Mossad in Israel had known about him on 3 separate occasions. They knew about him in 1975, 72, And the Canadians were only aware of them in 1978 after the Americans had informed them.
Well, why would the Mossad, this very tough Israeli spy network, they're the killers, aren't they?
Well, they're pretty hard bunch of people.
Yeah, if there are any 007s around, they are in the
It's very
Mossad,
possible.
isn't that correct?
Right.
If the Mossad knew about them in 75, you see, why wouldn't we be told?
Well, I was on a program a couple of days ago with a fellow called Bill Kelly, who was the former head of security.
I remember Kelly, yes. Little thin Mountie, retired
That's right.
5 years. He was our top SS man.
Exactly. And Kelly told me that in all probability, this information came across the desks of the security service in this country, but they didn't act.
Why not?
Well, we seem to have a kind of political reticence about acting towards Russia, mainly because we sort of pride ourselves, perhaps erroneously, on a kind of neutrality, and we want to be as inoffensive as we can. And it results, of course, in Canada being the most fertile area in the world for Soviet agents.
Well, there was a time not so many years ago when every Soviet spy in the world carried a Canadian passport. With a name off a Canadian graveyard.
Exactly, and they probably still do. But I think what is...
no, that was the days when you could apply for passports in the mail. They stopped that.
I see. It was probably a little more difficult today.
Do you know this man, Hambleton?
Well, I've known him for about 30 years.
Does he admit that he knows you?
Well, the last communication after I visited him in prison in Gartree, which is the high security prison in England after he was convicted of the Old Bailey, was a letter from his lawyer which said, "I wish to inform you that Mr. Hambleton has said that he does not know you."
More with Leo Heaps on Hugh Hambleton, spy, 30 years with the KGB. That's Hambleton, not Heaps, after the break. Now, you stated categorically that Hugh Hambleton is a spy, was a spy.
It was a spy, right.
What Hugh Hambleton said was that he did provide the Soviet Union with information of a general economic nature, but never passed on sensitive military or political information. I do not think of myself as a spy. A spy is someone who regularly gets secret material, passes it on, takes orders, and gets paid for it. I have never been paid. Now, where did you first meet Hambleton?
First met him at Lisgar Collegiate, believe it or not. He was a grade or two ahead of me when we went to high school. That's how long ago it was. And throughout the years, as a matter of fact, he helped me in the preparation of another book called The Quebec Plot, which I wrote. And he had, I suppose we had met every 3 or 4 years during his entire period. But he had this amazing disarming quality about the man that one could never really accuse him and believe it. I mean, the information that you just read out is the information which is part of the disinformation, which Hambleton was an expert at giving. And this was also before the NATO connection was known. This was after, incidentally, or before, yes, after he was granted immunity. He was granted immunity by the Canadians. And then after that immunity was granted, the RCMP, this political immunity was granted, were not satisfied. And they kept, week after week, pursuing this man until finally he mentioned that he had done something at NATO which provided them with a clue. And then all this NATO business came out. And this is why...
You mean the Mounties asked Washington?
They asked Washington, and they also asked the NATO headquarters itself. And they began to search the information, and they found this volume of information that Hambleton had given NATO.
Why would he have, what do you mean political immunity?
Well, there seems to be some political overtones in this trial. For instance, on Hamilton, in his home in Ottawa, they found council papers, the Privy Council papers. The security service, somebody quite high in the security service has told me that because of the people involved in this particular network, which they believed existed for some time, that other names might be forthcoming. And therefore, any attempt to try Hambleton here, and the Mounties, I've seen the case, it was absolutely a watertight, an airtight case against Hambleton. There was no escape. But the Solicitor General refused to pursue this. And this was what was not comprehensible to anybody who had the evidence. And the Mounties, of course, were very frustrated. One of the Mounties in the case resigned from the force, who was involved directly in this. The other one pursued it to the end, and they provided the information which made Sir Michael Haver's prosecution successful.
Now, he was then in Canada. He was at the time he was in Canada, and he had been given, apparently, freedom from particular prosecution.
Right.
Why did he go to England?
He went to England.
Because the story broke about his activities before he went to England, is that it?
That's right. Well, actually, he was warned not to go to England. He was warned several times. But the year before, he had also gone to England, unknown to most people, and to do a conference at Exeter University. And at that conference, he met two Russians, one an Indian from India who was lived in Russia, another who was a Russian. His contacts were in East Berlin and in Vienna, and he had to contact these people in order to make a defect. He took his son with him. And there is inescapable evidence, plus what he has told me in the 5 or 6 meetings we've had, that he had gone to the United Kingdom to defect to the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the special branch closed in too quickly.
You mean the Mounties tipped off the special branch and they picked him up?
They picked him up, but the special branch had sufficient information on their own to act.
He was then tried in the Old Bailey.
That's right.
What was the sentence?
The sentence was 10 years, but he had already served 1 year. But he was given a light sentence because he admitted his guilt. He confessed, and they didn't pursue the second charge, which was spying from 1970 to 1978, which would have been the most damaging to Canada. Because in that charge, it showed how CEDA, the Canadian Industrial Development Agency, had really sponsored, unknowingly, unwittingly, presumably, the most comprehensive espionage that ever took place in the Caribbean and South America. He was in key positions in Peru. He headed the mission in Haiti. And after that, the story unfolded.
Hambleton is now doing?
He's doing probably another 2 years. He will probably be out.
At least he won't get an appointment to Buckingham Palace, will he?
No, but he may be back teaching at Laval University. This is entirely possible.
You saw him. What was the name of this high security
It was
prison?
called Gartree, and it's near Leicester in the United Kingdom. It's where the spies go, and you can only be interviewed in the presence of a third individual.
Right, therefore. He was found guilty by the British High Court in the Old Bailey.
Right.
He got 10 years for spying.
Right.
And did you see him before or after his conviction?
Saw him both times.
Both times?
Right.
Recognized you?
He recognized me completely.
Spoke to you freely?
Exactly.
Admitted his spying?
He admitted his activity, all of it, that's right.
But you leave behind a miasma of concern, and I don't find reds under every bed, that a man like this can be known to the Mossad, the Brits probably too.
And the Yugoslavs arrested him 5 years before the Canadians did, and interrogated him.
The Yugoslavs?
The Yugoslavs, and as he was going through Belgrade on the way to Vienna.
So they knew about it?
Exactly, 1975 they knew about it.
The last ones to know are the Canadians?
Exactly.
And once the Canadians know about it, they give him political immunity?
They gave him immunity from prosecution.
Would it not be better to say that they decided not to charge him?
Supposedly in exchange for information, yes.
He cooperated?
That's what they say, but he really gave him very little information.
Do we need a new security service in this country?
We need somebody really to head a security service who knows something about security. And
instead of the Mounties?
Well, no, I think the Mounties, I have no brief for the Mounties. I was very critical of them in this book. But looking at the new security agency, it seems to me that we haven't got the tradition of MI5 or even the CIA or France.
Well, mind you, look at the British tradition. Goodness gracious me, you finish up as an exposed agent where you're an art advisor to the Queen. It seemed that half of the people who went to Moscow in the 30s finished up as KGB-type homosexual spies.
Well,
maybe we should have an ordinary guy of common sense who's been around.
No, on the other hand, you shouldn't. The British had their Philbys, Maclean,
Burgesses.
Burgesses, and Blunts, and so on. But that's only one side. In the other side of the British intelligence service, you have a lot of capable people. Now, I would dare say you look at any intelligence service, the French, the British, and even the Canadian. We see that there's spies and double agents and on them all.
The trouble is that you can't tell anybody from anybody else in the secrecy of this particular underworld without a program.
This is pretty well, I think, sums it up.
Leo, it'll be a good book. I haven't read it yet.
Well, it's the Book of the Month Club. I hope
Book of the Month Club.
I hope a few of my relatives will read it, and it'll be an interesting story, I think.
Well, I can interview Hambleton when he comes back to teach at Laval.
Why not? I think it would be a very exclusive interview.
My thanks to Leo Heaps.
Thank you very much.
Much obliged, old boy. I'll be back after the break. Sorry, I was a bit snippy this morning. I found that Hambleton thing quite good, though. The proof of the pudding is that Hambleton is doing 10 years in wherever. I think it's a high-level security prison in London for spying for the Russians. It's quite funny, you know. The Mounties did a full-scale investigation, never have a chance, the guy. I'm waiting for a clip to come up on Brian Smith, the Attorney General, about what he's got to say about the riot at Oakalla last night, what caused it, what's going to be done. And here is Brian Smith, the Attorney General of British Columbia.
We have a full-scale investigation taking place now into the incident and what occurred and whether any criminal acts were involved. And that investigation will be completed as quickly as possible.
Where are the inmates going to be kept now?
Well, they're in temporary accommodation now in Oakalla. It's not been determined whether they'll go back to the same wing they were in or not, but they're in temporary accommodation. All of this was a temporary move for a period of about 2 months while the regular wing that they're in was being upgraded for fire purposes as part of that program that we'd instituted a year or so ago.
Was that why there was a riot?
That seems to be the cause of it, as far as we can tell. But it wasn't a violent or ugly event, but it was a serious one nevertheless. And the RCMP from Burnaby were called in with reinforcements should they have been needed.
Was that wing overcrowded?
No, I don't think it was overcrowded, but they don't have the same amount of freedom of movement as they have in the regular wing. It's not as pleasant a place to be in, but it was only for a temporary purpose that they were there, and the main purpose was that we would put them back into the old wing with absolute 100% fire safety.
But you're saying, though, in effect, that dissatisfaction in being in there may have been the reason that they...
I think that was probably the root cause, that there was dissatisfaction. Any sort of change in an institution like this is not well regarded, and if you have a fair amount of space and freedom and then that's suddenly confined, that's upsetting in an institution. I think that was the root of it, as far as I can tell.
Any initial estimate of damage?
No, but no injuries to any guards and no damage, so far as we can tell, to any of the inmates.
Could I just ask you this question over again? We were
Sure,
to film
yes.
The possible cause of this outburst.
The suspected cause is moving them from the old wing into this temporary accommodation, which is more confined. They did not have as much freedom as they had in the old wing.
The main question is what's going to be done to replace Oakalla? That's been an issue that's been going on for donkey's years.
Well, we have a policy of gradually decentralizing out of Oakalla, and the first phase of that has already taken place. That's the Vancouver Pre-Trial Center down on Main Street, which is in operation now. But the other parts of that policy have not been completed and have been delayed somewhat due to a delay in capital spending, so that the rest of that policy will be carried out, but not as quickly as we had planned.
What time frame are we talking about now? What was your initial time frame?
Well, the initial time frame was that we'd have had some further construction underway at present, but there's been no construction in 1983 due to the freeze, and I would hope that we could make some plans in 1984 and get on with some of that second phase of decentralizing out of Oakalla. There's no question that moving the inmates into smaller security centers is a better policy than keeping everyone in Oakalla.
But the phasing.
Oh, another little whisper out of Oakalla. A number of the members of Local 103 are unhappy with the new contract, and they feel that it takes away their half-hour paid lunch break in the jail and loses them 13 days of previous accumulated time off under the old contract, 13 days a year. However, I think they're stuck with it, but I don't know. Phone calls. Webster.
Yes, Mr. Webster.
Morning, sir.
I think the kindest thing that could be said for you is that you're slowing down a bit in your dotage.
That may well be true, sir, and you sound about 95 yourself.
Look, you had a gentleman on there that was in a position to give you information or further discussion on probably the potential for the greatest scandal in this country's current history, and you let him go. I think your repertorial skills leave much to be desired.
I'm very sorry, sir. I'm very sorry. I do my very best. I go jump in the lake. Have no mood for that garbage this morning from somebody. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Good morning.
Good morning. What do you think Hamilton's motive was? If he wasn't inspired by money, maybe he was inspired politically. And if
Ideological motives. The guy was a spy for the KGB. He was nailed by the Brits. His motives were to damage the Western democracies.
Well, then why is it the opinion of this author of yours that he may even go back into teaching university in Canada?
Because that's how we do things in Canada. And that's how it's sometimes done in Britain, where they put spies up against the elbow of the Queen. Blunt that was. Good morning.
Good morning, Jack.
Good morning.
Yes, I have a solution for the spy.
What's the solution for the spy?
When he gets out next year, instead of teaching in the university, why does he become a member of Trudeau's cabinet?
Oh, thank you, sir. That's a wonderful suggestion. Armstrong, British Columbia.
Morning, Jack.
Morning.
Jack, you've had some very interesting people on this morning. I appreciate it. As regards Mr. Heaps, I think he's just touched the tip of the iceberg. I think the way it works today, the Canadian Economic Development Company supplies the money and Castro supplies the muscle. we bankrolled the airport in Grenada. I can go on and on and on, like the reforestation program in Peru, where they spent,
oh, I know.
You know, on and on and on. But how much did they spend in Canada? They spent $420 million abroad in reforestation last year. They spent $80 million in Canada.
Thank you, sir. Good point. Go ahead, please.
Morning, Jack.
Morning.
About the Canadian spy, I just have one observation. Have you ever heard of a KGB mole for the CIA being uncovered?
Just a minute.
That's something that...
KGB mole for the CIA.
Yeah, well, they have a closed society over there, Jack.
Let me tell you my own spy story. When I was a very young reporter, a man was pointed out to me who had been planted in Germany by the Brits in 1918 with his face changed by plastic surgery to resemble a German officer. And he finished up, was it in the First World War? Must have been the Second World War, on the German High Command. Face surgery and all to look like the man he replaced.
Yeah,
the stories are endless, but spies, schmies, KGB, CIA, they're all interchangeable and can change sides at any given time on any day of the week. No, I'm not. I'll be serious now. Good morning, Prince George.
And good morning, Jack.
Yes.
I'll tell you, a lot of guys been in there this morning.
Yeah? Come on, say something.
Oh, okay, Jack. No, I was just wondering if you were talking to me or somebody else.
Talking to you.
Okay. A lot of people been kicking your butt around this morning. What's wrong with them? Haven't you been doing a good enough job over the last few years?
They're stupid, short-sighted, illiterate, and insensitive. That's what they are. And I'll be back after the break. What day's tomorrow? Thursday. All day? For sure. I'm going to form a new club tomorrow, on the air. It's called the AJWFC. And if you work that out, you get a Webster t-shirt at 9 a.m. precisely.